together begin reshaping and rethinking disability as a natural phenomenon. To increase our awareness of the disability community's unique history, because I don't think a lot of people know that we have an incredibly rich history. And 3, recognize that the disability community has its own culture. And 4, recognize that empowerment of individuals in the disability community comes from an awareness and pride in their unique history, culture, and identity. Throughout the presentation, I will be providing you with what I'm calling a moment to stop and think. I want you to take the time to really consider the question that is presented and maybe take some notes on your thoughts, or even better, put them in the chat box. I would love to see your responses. We'll have about 10 minutes at the end dedicated to questions and answers, and my hope is that this will give us ideas to discuss. So let's get started. We know that disability is pervasive across society. It does not discriminate against race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, religion, or any other category that we can create. Disability is not a good or a bad thing, it just is. It's a part of human existence across the globe. And of course, there can be a secondary aspect of disability, like physical pain, atrophy, immobility, or disorientation. These are often considered negative consequences of disability, and with the current discussion, I'm not suggesting that we minimize these experiences. I do, however, think, though, that by recognizing disability as a natural yet valuable part of human existence, we can slowly begin to shift the perspective of mainstream society. Through researching the topics of disability history and culture, I've discovered that the respect, inclusion, and success of individuals with disabilities is directly related to how society views the condition of being disabled. For example, many North American indigenous tribes did not have a word for disability in their language. As a result, tribes viewed individuals as possessing unique gifts and talents, and these were their specific contributions to the community that no one else could offer. This is a real-life example of how disability, being a neutral concept and viewed as a natural phenomenon, can benefit an entire community. Before we dive any deeper into our history, though, I want to share a couple personal experiences. By doing so, I hope you'll see that I'm weaving a thread through our shared experiences in the present to the events of the past. My disability is incredibly fluid and unstable. There are days I require the use of a wheelchair, and some days I walk. Some days I have my vents on, like today, and some days I don't. There's some days where I can't have a conversation with a friend, but some days I can attend professional meetings and actively participate. My ability level varies by the day, really. What this means is that I know what it's like to walk through this world and be treated as if I were able-bodied, because on some days I pass, but on other days I walk through this world visibly disabled, and these two experiences are drastically different. This brings a lot of confusion into my interpersonal relationships, because when the look or presentation of my disability changes, people get confused and don't know how to interact with me. If I show up one day with no equipment, I'm asked about how my college planning is going, how my job is going, what are my plans for the week. If I show up with equipment, the conversation steers to how I'm feeling. Ironically enough, other people's perception of my disability and abilities are often more times of a hindrance than my actual disability. If a building was 100% accessible, my wheelchair ceases to be an issue. The problem with my disability often lies within other people and their perceptions and biases, and not my body. In my personal examples, you may have noticed 1, assumptions of ability, 2, assumptions of disability, 3, how these assumptions guide others' interactions with me, and 4, how these form expectations of me from other people. I share these experiences because I think they're common within our community. When we explore the events of the past, I think you will notice shared connections and experiences between what we're experiencing today and what our ancestors experienced in the past. I want to provide you with an outline of a few specific moments in our disability history. The events we talk about today will be discussed in chronological order, and there may be some words used that today are no longer considered appropriate. In no way do I support using these terms, but when discussing historical events, it serves to illuminate the plight of our community and the progress that we've made. All these events speak to a larger story and a larger theme, and I want you to begin thinking about the key concepts that tie everything together. So let's start during the Civil War. The Invalid Corps were a military reserve organization created by the Union for partially disabled veterans to perform light duties. It was unexpected that they would ever see battle again, but fate held a different plan. Here's an excerpt from a book entitled A Disability History of the United States by Kim Nielsen, which describes this event. Charles Johnson, whose wartime injuries left him disabled, led the Invalid Corps troops into major combat with Confederate forces in June 1864. In the midst of the battle, Colonel Johnson's commander sought reassurance from Johnson that his men would not retreat. He asked Johnson via messenger, "Will your invalids stand?" "Tell the general," Johnson replied with deadpan humor, "that my men are cripples and they cannot run." These troops' successes delighted Johnson, especially as their success ran counter to the stereotypes about disability. And I know for me at least, it's comforting to know that people with disabilities have shared the same sarcastic sense of humor for literally hundreds of years. Further, it's important to note that these soldiers were successful because they were put in a situation with high expectations, and they were utilized in a capacity because of their ability, and not discounted because of their disability. Their leader believed in their skills, and they succeeded in a tremendous way. Aren't these the opportunities that we still advocate for today? In the United States, from 1867 to 1974, federal law stated, quote, "Any person who is diseased, maimed, or deformed in any way as to be unsightly or disgusting objects to expose him or herself to public view." It was essentially illegal for visibly disabled people to show themselves in public. Exceptions were made only if these people were used as an example to the public and reason for further segregation. This legislation was deemed the ugly laws. It was, again, illegal for visibly disabled people to be seen in public. And we can still see that there is stigma in being visibly disabled today. Obviously, we're not being arrested for it, but who hasn't felt the stigma of going out in public in a wheelchair or with a vent? I mean, sometimes I just want to go to Costco with my cannula and not have everyone freak out that a real life disabled person has walked into the room. I could fill this whole session with unwarranted comments from strangers, and I'm sure we could all spend hours talking about the stories of being visibly disabled. On the flip side, though, people with invisible disabilities face stigma for not being disabled enough. I've heard countless stories of my chronically ill friends parking in a disabled parking spot and receiving nasty notes on their windshield, or being confronted face to face by strangers about faking. Isn't it incredible how you can trace themes of stigma throughout hundreds of years of history? So now we're moving on to the 1960s and 70s and diving into the independent living movement. It started with a group of students with disabilities, led by Ed Roberts on the UC Berkeley campus. They began the independent living movement from a desire to have greater access and freedom as adults living a self-determined life. In 1972, the student group moved from campus into the community and founded the first independent living center in the country. The website for the Vermont Center for Independent Living says, "The independent living movement and disability rights movement that grew out of this was unique in two critical ways. First, people with disabilities were in charge of their own advocacy organization. They moved away from the charity-based model that dominated many existing disability organizations. Second, people with various types of disabilities began to join together in their advocacy efforts." What we can learn from this movement is that by respecting individuals' rights to direct their own lives, we create an authentic and inclusive community, not one that is fabricated by what others think is best, or stripped of independence, risk, and natural consequence. We should also keep in mind that working in silos doesn't help to push our movement forward. The silo of comparison can apply to agencies that serve the disability community, disability-specific groups, and parent-professional self-advocate collaborations. Cross-disability advocacy, as we can see in our examples, have proven to be timeless and highly effective. Keep in mind, the independent living movement happened in the early to mid-70s. On the tail end of the student-led movement came the legislation and advocacy that would continue to build on their momentum. So what was that legislation that I just mentioned? In 1973, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act was developed by Congress to protect the right to people with disabilities in any program receiving federal funds. Despite being developed and written, 4 years passed without it being signed into law. So, in the words of the press of the time, a small army of the handicapped moved into the health, education, and welfare buildings across the country on April 5th to pressure Hugh Secretary Joseph Califano into finally signing 504. The sit-ins weren't easy for the protesters by any stretch. The longest sit-in lasted 28 days. But the momentum of cross-disability advocacy was still going. Let's take a moment to consider, though, the physical needs of the various disabilities. The para and quadriplegics needed personal assistance to turn them so they didn't get bed sores. Some people went without backup ventilators or catheters. These people had to rig a fridge out of a cardboard box duct taped to an air conditioner to keep their medications cold. I also don't want us to overlook the contributions of the non-disabled advocacy groups either. The Black Panthers provided hot meals. Women's rights groups and LGBT rights groups also lended help. And this help was absolutely critical to the success of the sit-ins. It demonstrated the understanding that disability doesn't discriminate, and that everyone deserves equality and respect. It's about building a better community for everyone. And they succeeded. On April 28, 1977, Section 504 was signed. Judith Hooven explained, "Through the sit-in, we turned ourselves from being oppressed individuals into being empowered people. We demonstrated to the entire nation that disabled people can take control over their own lives and take leadership in the struggle for equality." There's actually a documentary on Netflix that outlines what happened before the 504 sit-in, how the 504 sit-in played out, and what happened as a result by interviewing key players in this protest. It's called Crip Camp, and I strongly encourage you to check out the trailer and the movie whenever you have the time. It's an incredible documentary that demonstrates everything that we're discussing today. they went to a camp called Camp Jened, and it provided people with individuals an accepting environment where disability was natural and normalized. And this experience empowered them to later go on and literally change the course of disability history. This is how normalization of disability turns into extraordinary empowerment. Another vital piece of legislation is the American with Disabilities Act, which we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of at this conference. While the Rehab Act only protected people with disabilities from discrimination in public arenas, the ADA covers both the private and public sectors. It gives broad protection from discrimination across the board. And I think that's something definitely worth celebrating. One of the most notable moments in disability history was the Capitol Crawl. It was one of the major catalysts for the ADA being passed into law after being stalled in Congress for 2 years. And what's striking to me is the Rehab Act got stalled for 4 years and the ADA got stalled for 2 years. That's just nuts to me. Back to the Capitol Crawl, according to the ADA Legacy section of the state of Minnesota's government website, this protest was intended to openly illustrate the struggles that people in the disability communities faced and spurred Congress to pass the ADA. About 1,000 other protesters watched as members of ADAPT threw themselves out of their chairs and began to crawl up the step of DC's West Capitol entrance. Together, the March and Crawl comprised one of the largest disability-driven direct actions to date. A lot of people thought this protest to be undignified, but it was a raw and emotional representation of what people with disabilities have to face on a day-to-day basis. And it worked. Congress noticed. I do think it'd be kind of hard for Congress not to notice a bunch of people with disabilities throwing themselves out of their chairs, but that's me. And the ADA was finally passed on July 26 of 1990. These are historical examples of people with disabilities against all odds, fighting for the ability to create a self-determined future. I don't want to give the impression that these are the only notable moments in disability history. I want to encourage you to do your own research and learn about the events and leaders of our past. Because like I said earlier, our history is so incredibly rich. So here's a moment to stop and think. Let's take a moment to reflect on our current advocacy efforts. Are we seeing similar trends today that connect what we're fighting for now to all of these key points in our history? I'm going to give us about a minute and a half to think about this. And please, put your answers in the chat. I'd love to see them. So here we go, a moment to stop and think. So that was our minute and a half. I hope you didn't mind my Darth Vader noises in the background. So welcome back. So now we're moving along to the culture portion of this presentation. Our history serves as a foundation for our current cultural identity. I'll use Louisiana as an example. Louisianians are proud people. We love our food, our music, our faith. There are things in our history that are moments of pride and moments of shame. We have to know our history, the good and the bad, to fully understand where we are and where we want to be. The same goes for our disability community. When asked what disability culture is, my friend Will Watkins from Oklahoma describes it perfectly. He says that disability culture is a unifying sense of both identity and pride. We have our own history, language, community. Why not be proud of where we came from while we attempt to join the world? Think about it. At its core, it's a celebration of the uniqueness of disability. It's taking pride in who you are, who your children are, and with disability, not despite disability. The spirit of the disability community over and over has consistently thrived in settings made to dampen it. Louisiana was home to one of the nation's only institution for Hansen's disease, formerly known as leprosy. Despite being totally isolated from general society, the people there created their own sense of community by forming a baseball team, a newspaper, which is still in print today actually, and even a Mardi Gras crew, like you can see on the screen. Think back to the success of the Hugh sit-ins. Individuals with all types of disabilities thrived in a setting where they would normally suffer and decline. Instead, they achieved landmark success. Let's take another moment to stop and think. Consider some examples of positive community spirit, examples of how you have seen our community overcome these narratives of oppression. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts about this because building community starts with the sharing of ideas. So someone on YouTube commented that it seems that we keep going backwards in the disability world. She says, I think the strides for inclusion and education we made in the early 2000s, and now in the 20s, we're going back to seclusion again. And I think that's a really important perspective to consider and discuss because it feels like we're constantly fighting against something in the disability world. And I think this comment really speaks to what we're going to be discussing really soon. So I'm excited about that. So thank you for your comment. I appreciate it. And on that note, let's take a moment to step back and recognize, despite the positive communities formed, examples of segregation, isolation, and forced helplessness have defined the way that mainstream society interacts with individuals with disabilities. Going back to our victors in the Invalid Corps, they were forced to wear their own distinct uniforms, visibly separating them from the rest of the military. In a final report, Captain J.W. DeForest, the last commander of the Corps, wrote these observations about the uniforms. The uniform was becoming, but has never been popular. The men did not like to be distinguished from their comrades of active service by a particular costume. They wanted to keep their dark blue blouse and dress coat in which they had learned their profession and received their honorable disabilities. Just think to the ugly laws that we discussed earlier. These were yet another embodiment of segregation, and like that really well put comment on YouTube, these themes are still present today. And I think that's something that we need to discuss, because we can't fix it if we're not addressing it and talking about it. Our history is absolutely rampant with themes of imposed isolation and helplessness, because disability is considered abnormal, undesirable, and at the very best, uncomfortable. But now I want to talk about how we can start to shift this narrative. By teaching our disability history and fostering our own disability culture here today, we are learning about where we've been, appreciating our uniqueness, and recognizing those changes that still need to be made. In order to advocate today, we need to have a measure of where we've been and where we want to go, and also the tools that worked in the past. We're creating a reflection of the world that we want to live in by creating our own culture, and that's the world without that imposed isolation or helplessness. We must ask ourselves, if we need to take measure, who has the measuring stick? How do we own our future and set expectations if we don't even know where we're coming from? Stephen E. Brown says, "For years, we have discussed integration like it was our business to fit in with mainstream society. As we become more aware of our own unique gifts, some of us have also become more convinced that this is a backwards perspective. It's absolutely not our job to fit into mainstream society. Rather, it's our destiny to demonstrate to society that it is to their benefit to figure out that we come attached to our wheelchairs, our ventilators, our canes, our hearing aids, etc. And to receive the benefit of our knowledge and experience, mainstream society needs to figure out not how we fit in, but how we can be of benefit exactly the way we are." If we want to successfully shift the way society thinks about disability, the first step is through a broad increase of self-determination and empowerment throughout our community. Because if you don't believe you have something worth saying, chances are you're not going to share it. By giving people with disabilities the tools to determine their own life, our lives, we are by extension empowering them to speak up about the world they want to see. We often think of empowerment as an endpoint or a destination, but it's more like something we have to constantly work on, a process without an endpoint like happiness. We must understand that empowerment is not a give and take event, but rather a fluid experience, because power itself only exists within the context of human relationships. What I mean by this is that empowering one group, that does not have to mean that you're disempowering another. By calling for empowerment of people with disabilities, it's not a demand for the disempowerment of others, like parents or professionals. We are simply calling for an increased collaboration among everyone in the community. But we can't have full collaboration without full participation. And if we want to claim full participation, we need more self-advocates at the table. I know it sometimes feels like our community is up against the world, fighting tooth and nail for basic human necessities and basic human respects. I mean, we've all felt it and we've all seen it. Long term, we're looking at system change for every system we're involved in. Looking at our history, though, our rich disability history, we will see that every major breakthrough did not have just one catalyst. There were hundreds of people behind every system changed and every law passed. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. We must do this together. We cannot brave this alone. And even if this weren't the case, why would we want to if we don't have to? James Charlton, author of Nothing About Us Without Us, and by the way, this is an excellent book to check out. It is full of great theory about disability. He argues that any specific increase and significant increase in self-determination experienced by people with disabilities can be traced back to one of four factors. One, grassroots activism. In Louisiana, I think we can check this one off the list. We have an incredibly strong grassroots advocacy network, and our community organizations are also interconnected with these networks. Two, common experiences of oppression. I think we can also check this one off the list if we are a parent of or an individual with a disability. Three, empowerment. We can't wait for mainstream society to empower us. The world is caught up in so many things right now, and encouraging empowerment for the disabled is definitely not one of them. Rather, we have to be the ones to pass the stories of the people who came before us to the people who are coming after us. And by extension, we are empowering one another. We have to be the ones to empower one another. Four, culture and identity. Like we've discussed, in this community, we are constantly fighting for something. But tell me, how often do we celebrate the battles that we have won? Would love to see our community be able to step back from the fight for maybe half an hour to just celebrate. Look back and say, we have come so far. I am proud to be a part of this community because we have started to build the world that we want to see. We have a long way to go, but we have come so far. Our history and our culture is something that I believe we should take deep pride in. And this month is Disability Pride Month. So as you look forward to the rest of this conference and the rest of this month, keep our history and our culture in mind, and the lasting impacts it's still having on our community today. I want to close with a quote from Cheryl Murray Wade. She says, "Disability culture. Say what? Aren't disabled people just isolated victims of nature or circumstance? Yes and no. True, we are far too often isolated, locked away in pits, closets, and institutions everywhere. But there is a growing consciousness among us, because there is always an underground. Notes get passed among survivors, and the notes that we are passing these days says, there is power in difference. Power, pass the word. Culture, it's about passing the word. And disability culture is passing the word that there is a new definition of disability, and it includes power. I want to thank you for spending this time with me today. My hope is that you walk away with a greater understanding of our rich history and our rich culture, and with the knowledge that we share this history, you and I. Although I hope you walk away knowing that you too can pass the word that there is power in difference. Thank you. So now I want to open it up for questions, if anyone has any. I'd love to have some discussions. Let's see if I can stop the screen share. Hello, now I can see y'all.
Lillian, this is Bambi. Lynette Fontenot, who is the chairperson of the Governor's Advisory Council on Disability Affairs, says, incredible presentation. You're an inspiration to people with disabilities. And that is that is quite a compliment coming from someone like Lynette, who is an inspiration to so many people. So just want to share that with you and everyone.
I really appreciate that, Lynette, especially coming from you. I'm really honored to have that compliment. I hope we can work together some more in the future. Liz Gary, I see in the chat, says when we work together, collaborating as advocates, organizations, agencies, etc., success can be achieved. And I think that's a really important conversation to discuss, because I mean, like we talked about earlier, we're so often working in silos. Like our disability organizations are functioning on their own. Professionals may be advocating without self-advocates and parents. And I think working together is the way to get through and get the most done, because everyone has such a different perspective, but every perspective is so valuable and lends to the bigger picture.
We also have a comment from Nicole Flores. Thank you for sharing the incredible presentation information. I loved hearing about culture and history and how we made it to where we are and how we can keep making a difference moving forward. And Dr. Hyacinth McKee, who is our colleague on the DD Council, says empowerment, advocacy, and transformation are themes of SUNO, School of Social Work, which is Southern University in New Orleans. And thank you for including that in the discussion as we move forward.
Oh, that's a great point. Thank you, Ms. Hyacinth. And I think having these discussions of culture and history is just so important. I mean, even just speaking as a person with a disability, it's hard to find role models kind of in the mainstream media because there's no one that looks like you. And so being able to look back at our history to previous self-advocates is so inspiring, because it's people like you making a difference for people like you. And that's one of the most magical things I think a person with a disability can see.
A lot of people liked your empowerment, advocacy, and transformation theme.
I see your comment, Ms. Hyacinth, about, she says, thank you for your leadership and passion to educate others on our history. It's important that we know our history so we do not repeat the inequities from the past. She hit the nail on the head. She said it better than I ever could. Ms. Hyacinth has a knack for that. She's got a way with words, I'm telling you. But she's exactly right. I mean, we can definitely learn from everything that happened in the past. I mean, people with disabilities worked so hard for so long. I mean, it took, 4 years for the Rehabilitation Act to be passed after it was written? You know, it's holding our legislators accountable and being that voice and saying, hey, we need rights now, not later, but now. And I think that's what ADAPT was saying when they crawled up the steps of the Capitol. I mean, if you think about it, who can ignore that? Like, what legislator can ignore a bunch of people with disabilities crawling up the steps? I mean, that's so powerful.
Lillian Clarice Gagos, who founded Clubhouse in, I think I'm saying the right name, in Lafayette. She said she's excited about this part, and mental illness for adults 18 years and older so often gets lost. Just want your thoughts on that.
Definitely. I think that's, I mean, even sitting on the DD Council, we've gotten a lot of input about the lack of mental health services. And that's a crisis in our community right now, where we don't have enough mental health services, especially for people with disabilities, despite the fact that there are people with disabilities who have mental health needs. And that's definitely a conversation that we need to start having some more. So I think that's a really great point. Thank you for sharing.
Lillian, we have a few moments left, and you're talking about, people, crawling up the steps of the Capitol. And you and I took a trip to the Capitol a few years ago to DC. It was a very interesting trip. So I don't know if you wanted to share about that experience, about how, you know, advocacy impacted you in doing that trip, or.
Yeah, that was a pretty wild trip, I'm sure, as Miss Bambi can also tell you. So in 2017, as I'm sure most of you remembered, the federal government tried to do a repeal and replacement of Medicaid. And my family and I rely on now waiver services for a lot of my health care. And so Drake Mamas of Louisiana had a wild idea of renting a bus for a week, getting a bunch of people with disabilities on it, and heading to DC for 24 hours straight in a bus to go and speak with Senator Cassidy, who was the last holdout vote. CNN came along with us. They caught wind of the trip. So did Time Magazine. We were featured on national platforms, and it was the most life-changing trip because we boarded the bus as strangers. And then we got on this bus and spent 25 consecutive hours with each other, which is more than enough to get to know anyone. And at first it sounds like, I'm sure you're thinking, Lillian, why would you get on a bus with a bunch of strangers? Like, that's insane. That's because it was insane. But it was the most magical experience to be among such powerful advocates who would do anything just to keep our services. And so we didn't end up meeting with Senator Cassidy, but we ended up having a very loud voice thanks to the news coverage. And it was just life-changing. It was unlike anything we've ever seen. One of the most memorable moments from the trip was just being able to befriend everyone and learn from each other and everyone's different experiences. Ms. Bambi says, Jessica, what kind of idea was that, in reference to the bus trip? Because Ms. Jessica is one of the directors of Drake Mamas Louisiana. And to this day, we were all like, that feels like a fever dream, but we did that and we made an impact and it worked. And it was a pretty radical move, but as we can see from our history, the radical moves are the ones that really make the most impact. I could talk for like 2 days about that bus trip. I think the funniest, this is just funny, it's not really relevant to the current conversation, but it's funny because everyone had medical equipment and a lot of us had the same machines. So overnight while we were sleeping, ventilators and feeding pumps would go off, and every person on the bus who had a ventilator or feeding tube like dive down to go and try to turn off their machinery. And so like moms would tell their moms, it's okay, it's our pump, don't worry about it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have a comment from Jason Morris who says, thank you for all your work in this area. As a first person, self-advocate person with developmental disabilities, I'm in my 50s and I was in a segregated special ed classroom, K through 12, DDR in both, I think Alabama and Washington State. We've got to do more and pay teachers more and transition back into the community. You're absolutely right. And I mean, I think that just speaks to the broader experience where it's like segregation and isolation is still present and it's still happening, and it's happened in recent years. And having these discussions help move things along in terms of progress. But with that, I think that's a great point to end on. So I just want to thank you for spending this time with me today and chatting with me. So thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. Great job. It's wonderful. You are incredible, as everyone shared. So now what we'll do, we're finished with that, our first afternoon session, and we're going to move into our next session, which is going to start at 1 o'clock. We will allow, if you allow us to get set up, the session will be on the Louisiana Department of Health sessions for people with disabilities during the pandemic. And we will get started at 1 o'clock. And I'm sure it's going to be a session that's full of information. So be sure you get back on at that time. We'll keep our YouTube streaming as well as our Zoom. Thank you.